Welcome to the first concept capture in the topic 1 of cellular pathophysiology. This specific concept capture is on cellular adaptation and agents of cell injury. The learning outcomes for this concept capture is to describe the 4 types of cellular adaptations and differentiate these 4 with dysplasia. Number 2, identify the major agents of cellular injury. And number 3, compare and contrast necrosis with apoptosis. So just really quickly, we want to introduce some very important terms of pathophysiology. The first being, what is the cause of diseases? So every disease has a cause, and this is known as the etiology. Now, some of the causes can be known, and some can be not or yet to be known, and this is known as idiopathic. Now, every disease presents with a certain symptom or sign, which is known as the clinical manifestations. The symptoms, these are subjective observations or feelings by the patient, such as pain, whereas the sign, this can actually be seen or discovered by an external person, such as the doctor, such as the family member or friend. And an example of a sign would be swelling or redness. Now, the sequence of events that take place from the organ, the cell, even within the cell, and even to the molecular, okay, and how all those things progress into the causing the signs and symptoms, this is known as the pathogenesis. Now, understanding the pathophysiology or the pathogenesis of a disease will allow for accurate diagnosis. But before you can come to a diagnosis, typically you would put forward a number of differential diagnoses. And this is where working on the mechanism of the signs and symptoms, you can then hypothesize a number of conditions or diseases that may cause or may be candidates for that particular clinical manifestations. And this is known as the differential diagnosis. And then slowly you can work through that differential diagnosis list and rule in and rule out through certain tests and certain observations, and that can lead you to the definitive diagnosis, which is the final identification of the disease. The sequela, and this is what we call the complications. So whether there's further complications or there's a final resolution of that disease process. And then finally we have the prognosis, which is the probable outcome of that condition or disease. In order for the body to maintain homeostasis, it must respond to changes both internally and externally. Some examples of this could be temperature, it could be oxygen levels, it could be levels of ATP in the body, or just glucose, for example. Likewise, cells must respond to changes within the body or changes placed upon them. Cells must adapt to the changes placed upon them, and this can be both prolonged over a long period of time, but also short and very acutely. Now, the way that cells adapt can be reversible or irreversible. Focusing on just how cells adapt to the stresses placed upon them, we call this cellular adaptation. The way that cells can change or adapt to the environment can be either they can either get bigger in size, decrease in size, increase in number, or decrease in number. There are 4 examples or 4 types of cellular adaptation. Firstly, when there's a decrease in demand on the cells will respond, and most notably they'll decrease in their size. So the cells become smaller. This is what we call atrophy. Atrophy basically just means a reduction or or a lack of nourishment. Now, in this case of atrophy, there's usually either a decrease in demand, such as the part of the body is not being used anymore, such as a patient has fractured an arm, or a patient's in bed and they're not using their leg muscles. Therefore, the cells decrease in their size because they're not being utilized. Other things that can decrease or cause atrophy is stimulation. This could be both through hormones or nerves. So if you can think about it, if a person has, let's say, a spinal cord injury, so they sever their spinal cord, therefore signals getting down to the legs have decreased and stopped. Therefore the muscles in the legs aren't being stimulated, therefore they also decrease in size. So that's atrophy. Secondly, we have the opposite of atrophy, which is an increase in size. So this is usually as a result of more or greater demand. So in this case, these two cells, as you'd guess, they get bigger. And this is called hypertrophy. Which means an abundance of nourishment. Now with hypertrophy, as we'd imagine, in the opposite of atrophy, this is excessive stimulation. So think of it like a person goes to the gym and they do lots of heavy weights. Instead of their muscles getting smaller, they actually get bigger. The cell number doesn't change, they get an increased amount of protein and myofibrils in the cell, which causes the muscle to get bigger. So that's a normal response. A pathological response could be the heart, also a muscle. Given it too much stress over time, such as a high blood pressure, the heart tries to adapt and it gets bigger, which is a type of hypertrophy or heart megaly, increase in size, and that's adapting to the pressures that it's put upon it. Now this could become detrimental and ultimately lead to heart failure, which is a bad thing. The third type is where also an increase in stimulus or demand to the cells, but instead of it getting bigger, we actually increase it in number. So instead of just 2, like here, we increase it to 4. And this one is called hyperplasia, which is basically means excessive growth. Now, like hypertrophy, but in this case, it generally works on cells that are constantly going in mitosis, whereas muscle cells are generally stable. They're not going to reproduce themselves anymore. So in the cells that constantly reproduce, such as epithelium cells, these will actually increase in number and you get a greater number of them. Some examples of this could be the ductal cells in the breast as a result of release of estrogen, which is going to cause increase in ducts, therefore more production of milk. Another example of hyperplasia, maybe in this case a pathological example, would be in the prostate for males. And this is what we call a benign prostate hyperplasia. So an increase in number of cells, but in a certain area. Now this is a pathological response and can lead into some more cancerous states. Now the last state, or the last example of cellular adaptation, is what we call metaplasia. So metaplasia is actually a change in shape. So in this case we go from this type of cell and it becomes, let's say, squamous. So this is usually considered maybe the first starts of a possible cancerous state. Now what could cause this? But this is still reversible, it can still go backwards. A good example of this could be, let's say, smoking in the trachea. As we know, in the trachea you have nice little cilia, like so. But when you expose it to a stimulus, in this case smoking, it causes it to lose the cilia and then change form from a columnar type of cell into a squamous cell. And this can keep replicating and you can start to get squamous stratified cells there in your trachea or your bronchioles. So you lose your ability to be able to expel those certain things out, and as a result, they have to cough. Another example of metaplasia is the esophagus as a response. Is the esophagus to a response to excessive acid over long periods of time, such as GORD that comes up through the stomach and causes irritation to the esophagus. And then finally, so this is the four, but the final one I want to end with, which is not a type of adaptation, but it's still important to know, is dysplasia. And so I'll write it down here. Number 5. So dysplasia. This is not a type of cellular adaptation. This is a maladaptive response. So I'll draw the two cells in. But in this case, what happens is it changes in shape and number and becomes very disorganized. So you might have one looking normal cell, but then some smaller cells, and then another big one. And we've increased in both number, size, and shape. And this is called dysplasia. Dysplasia. So like here being growth, but instead of an increase in growth, this is a disordered growth. And they say this is usually the precancerous state. This case is irreversible, unlike these four. And so dysplasia, a good example of dysplasia is, say, growth of cells on the cervix in women, and therefore using the diagnostic pap smear can isolate these cells, and then it can be seen as they are precancerous, and then a treatment can be begun. So this is the 4 stages of cellular adaptation, and this is the maladaptive process of dysplasia. So now moving on to cell injury and the causes for such injury. As you'd imagine, there's probably a multitude of ways that a cell can be injured. Now, how the cell actually responds to the injury is dependent on a number of things, such as the type of injury, the duration of the injury, and the severity of the injury. So that's the response of the cell. But depending on how the cell can cope, thus whether it's going to be a reversible or irreversible injury is dependent more on the cell type and its adaptability. The first most common cause of cell injury is hypoxia. Hypoxia just means low levels of oxygen to a tissue or to a cell. Okay, and so this would then cause an impairment of ATP production, and that's why it's causing the problem. This is a very common cause of cell injury in many diseases. However, hypoxia itself can be distinguished in 2 classes, that's being hypoxemia and that being ischemia. Hypoxemia, firstly, is just the low levels of oxygen in the blood. So it's specific to the blood. This could be caused by a respiratory problem. This could be caused by such as COPD. This could be caused by a problem with oxygen binding to its hemoglobin, such as anemias, and it could be a problem with transport or movement, such as heart problems. Whereas when you look at ischemia, ischemia is specific to that area of tissue. So this is commonly caused when you've got blockages or obstruction of blood vessels to a specific area, such as atherosclerosis in the heart. Therefore, blood can't get to the heart itself, and that can cause a heart attack or angina, or more localized into a tissue like an emboli. Okay, so that could cause it to be blocked. Ischemia is the most common type of hypoxia. Moving on now to physical agents. Again, this is quite vast, and this could be examples such as trauma, physical trauma like a car accident, temperature, extreme temperatures like very, very, very cold or extremely hot, types of radiation such as the sun, UV radiation, or X-ray radiation, electric shock injury, or maybe just even atmospheric changes. The next category is chemicals. So chemicals really could be anything, and quite surprisingly, some of the things you wouldn't imagine could cause injury can actually cause injury. And so there's a famous saying that everything is a drug, it's just dependent on its dosage. So you could even look at water or oxygen, for example. So too much of water can kill a person, which it has done, or too much oxygen can cause certain free radical injury. Other examples could be glucose, salt, or it could just be drugs. Next one is microbiology. So this could range from the very, very small things such as prions and viruses all the way up to big things like worms. So we'll cover this in week 2. Moving on to immunological reactions or conditions that will cause damage. The most common is what we call hypersensitivity disorders, and there are 4 types of these. But basically a hypersensitivity condition is something that will come into the body or intrinsic in the body, elicits an immune response which then causes tissue injury. Another type of immunological injury is autoimmune diseases. We'll cover this in week 3. Genetic, so this could be either chromosomal or down at the gene level. Again, we'll cover this later in the semester in week 6, but an example of a chromosomal defect or causing injury is such as Down syndrome, whereas a gene defect where you're missing or you've got an abnormal gene causing an abnormal protein, such as what you'd find in cystic fibrosis. So they have a transporter gene on the membrane that causes a dysfunction, and that causes the disease cystic fibrosis. And then finally we have nutritional imbalances which can cause injury. These could be most commonly such as proteins or carbohydrate insufficiencies, common in the third world, to vitamin deficiencies such as vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin K, causing things like skin or mucous membrane or healing problems with vitamin C, vitamin D problems with calcium metabolism, or vitamin K, bleeding disorders. Other examples of nutrient disorders is minerals, iron deficiency causing anemia, or iodine deficiency causing problems with the thyroid. And then finally, you can actually have, and this is quite surprisingly, you can have excessive nutrients such as glucose in the blood, causing things like obesity and diabetes. So actually, too much of nutrients can be detrimental as well. Okay, so this leads us to the last part of the concept capture. This part is on the irreversible causes of cell injury. So we've already done the reversible ones. This is the 4 adaptations and dysplasia, but this one is the irreversible causes. And this has been apoptosis and necrosis. So firstly, what are they? Well, apoptosis is programmed cell death. So it's programmed meaning that the cell intrinsically decides to programmably kill itself. Also sometimes known as cell suicide. Whereas necrosis is unplanned, okay? So it's not programmed, and it results in autolysis, meaning it digests itself. Autolysis. So why would a cell do this? Well, for apoptosis firstly, apoptosis can be both physiological but also pathological. So it can be and pathological. What that means is the actual body can decide in a normal case to start to degrade or kill off cells. An example of this would be within the embryo or within the fetus as it's growing inside the uterus. Certain parts of the body need to be destructed or taken away to form the body in a complete manner. An example of that would be the hand or the feet, where you want to separate the digits, and then so you want to take cells away to form the separated digits. So that's an example of a physiological form of apoptosis. A pathological form of apoptosis is where maybe the cell's been injured or infected and it decides to end its life for the greater good of the whole body. Okay, so if it's been infected with a virus, it will destruct itself to save the body. Whereas necrosis is always pathological. And by definition, necrosis is just the morphological changes of intercell death. So it's from a lethal injury, and it's these steps that cause, which is necrosis itself. The next point is how many cells are involved. Well, with apoptosis, it's usually just one or a couple. Whereas with necrosis, it can actually affect a whole lot of tissue, so it's many, all the way out to a whole group of tissue. So what's the process behind it? Firstly, with apoptosis, it's either an intrinsic or an extrinsic initiated process, and it usually then activates a group of proteases, which are enzymes that break down proteins. The most common type is caspases. This causes a change in the porous of the mitochondria and the nucleus. It starts to swell and then degrade. It then causes other cells to come along and then slowly phagocyte it. And so it gets eaten and swallowed by phagocytes and macrophages, etc. Whereas with necrosis is usually causing a change within the cell. And so it causes changes within proteins and changes within lysozyme. And these proteins can be both structural and functional. So it can be the cytoskeleton and the functional proteins. So if they get degraded or denatured, so the cytoskeleton are the proteins that hold the cell together, if they get degraded, the cell will collapse in on itself. Whereas if you degrade the functional proteins, such as the pumps, such as the enzyme, the cell will start to become dysfunctional. Whereas the lysozymes, which are located in the cell, they'll start to spill off into the cell, which would degrade it and autolyse it, but as well as spilling out to all the cells around it, which causes damage and injury to those as well, which will cause other cells, immune cells, to come in and kill those off as well. So finally, with necrosis, it could then lead to other four types. Now, the other four types are coagulative. So this is where they start to become clotted and firm. So an example of this is where you have a protein that becomes denatured and it becomes harder, like an egg white would in an acid or in a hot environment. So if a tissue is being damaged in a certain way, like ischemia, it can cause a coagulative response or a coagulative necrosis. And this could be commonly found in the heart after a heart attack. Another example of necrosis is liquefative. This is where the cytoskeleton starts to break down and the tissue becomes liquid-like, commonly found in the brain after a stroke. The next type of necrosis is caseous, and this is kind of a combination of the first two. And the tissue becomes kind of like cheese-like. A common example of this is in the lung after it's been infected with tuberculosis. Now the last type of necrosis is fat necrosis. So as the name suggests, it's in tissue where there's a lot of adipocytes or fat cells. They bust open, they come into contact with calcium and other enzymes, which causes a fat-like appearance. Commonly, this could be found in pancreatitis. And then lastly, you might have heard of this being gangrene. Gangrene is where you have an amount of tissue that has been damaged, for example, ischemia, and that causes a change such as coagulative type of necrosis, such as what you'd find on the skin where it becomes black and cold and smelly. This is a type of gangrene called dry gangrene. Now, if that was to happen inside the body, so inside the actual organs, it would cause more that liquid-like necrosis, and we call that wet gangrene. And then the final type of gangrene is where it causes bubbles or gases to come off the breakdown or the necrosis, and that's what we call gas gangrene. Finally, with the apoptosis, if the apoptosis doesn't function correctly, it can lead to certain diseases like cancer or some neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease, where the cell actually fails to programmably kill itself and therefore becomes dysfunctional.